Boker Tov. Much like the class we had last Tuesday, I want to dedicate this again to Jim Gollin, our beloved community member and friend. And one of the things that Jim loved to do and did really beautifully, and someone was telling me today, his growth in that area was reading Torah publicly. And at his prime, he was just so precise and really cared about it. And one of the things that I know from working with him and standing up there is there are certain things that people who read from the Torah scroll, no matter how good they are, always trip them up. And that is something that is actually quite unique to our Torah reading this week, the Parsha of Vayechi, which concludes the story of not only Yosef and his brothers, but also concludes the story of Vayechi means and he lived. It's a story of Yaakov's life. He lived for 147 years. And then it's the transition going from the end of the book of Bereshit and that whole family saga with the brothers and everything. Ultimately, now we're in Egypt and we're going to become a great nation that will then become enslaved, et cetera, et cetera. So this is an important transition story that will end the first book of the Torah, book of Bereshit, into the book of Shemot. But very quickly, one who is reading from the Torah publicly will notice that there's something frustrating about reading it. So first, actually, Gloria, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you and just go ahead and read just the first line there, just kicks off our Parsha.
Jacob lived 17 years in the land of Egypt, so that the span of Jacob's life came to 147 years.
Excellent. Now, if we scroll down, and Gloria, I'll have you read another source in a moment, but if you scroll down here, you look at this column on the right that has that Hebrew word asher. Now, this is where if you were looking in a Torah scroll, it wouldn't have any of the vowels, but the letters would look like this. And what you would see is that little break in the middle, and then the word right after this, Vayigash. That is the beginning of last week's Torah reading. So if you're the Torah reader, you open up the scroll, you say Amen, and then you say, oh, Vayigash, great, that's where it starts. Vayigash elav, and you go on from there. But the left column is where our Parsha, Vayechi, that you just read the first line for. But you open up the scroll, and where is it? It's not so easy to find. And for those who are not familiar with what I'm about to teach about today, this may not seem so peculiar, but in the Torah, there are some very intentional breaks, and they're extremely helpful because they often show when a new weekly reading comes. So if you look deep inside of it, you'll see in the middle, eventually the word Vayechi, I don't know if I could highlight it, I don't know if you see my cursor, but in the middle, it has the word Vayechi, but it's very hard to find. And what you'll see throughout the Torah is that in all weekly portions, when a new section starts, there's a line break. It either starts on the next line or there's 9 spaces between it, but there's an intentional line break to let you know when a new portion starts. Now, the history of these line breaks, which were put in intentionally, is a little bit shrouded in mystery. The simple explanation is this: we are not certain what was exactly passed down from Moshe to the elders. We know it was the Torah. We know that parts of it were written down, if not the whole thing, but we already had a class about the letters might have been different. However, in the year 11, the oldest complete Torah scroll that we use today, we have from the year 1100. And what we know of is there were a group of rabbis called the Masoretes, from the word Mesorah, which means either tradition or passed down. And between the 7th and 10th century, they had dozens or perhaps more than dozens of different Torah scrolls that had different breaks, different words here and there, and they had to sit down and say, what is the authentic Torah that Hashem gave to Moshe and Har Sinai? So they spent several hundred years comparing texts, using common sense. Obviously, when this word that says Yosef went down makes sense, as opposed to Yosef ate an iguana, that's obviously not correct. And they also had to contend with the fact that certain letters are similar. This clearly was a scribal error, or someone tried to fix it wrong. So for several hundred years, they fixed the Torah text that we know today. Now, we have earlier Torah texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls that have some pretty big differences, but only in the layout of the text. In terms of the actual words and the stories and the commandments, those we know are quite ancient and with very few differences between the oldest scrolls that are available to mankind. But in terms of how it's broken down in these little breaks in between and new sections, it's fairly recent. But the flip side of that is we know that when they were put in intentionally. Just like when someone breaks down a book into chapters, chapter 1 is introduction, chapter 2 is where the action gets going. So too, these line breaks are intentional. They show when a new section starts. And we know that even the rabbis of the Talmud, which is much, much older than this Masoretic text, were familiar with a lot of these breaks. They talk about them. So these breaks are intentional and they're meant to tell us something. So if we know that pretty much every weekday or every single week, when there's a new section, a new weekly Parsha, there's going to be a break, and then we know intentionally there's not one here, maybe it's trying to tell us something. And that's what we're going to explore today. Why is this Parsha, the end of the book of Breshit, why does it not have a break? Again, it was not a break that was handed down from Moshe, although there are those who would argue that it was, but really it's a much more recent but intentional layout of the text. Why was it laid out differently? And it's not just to make the reading harder for those who are reading from the Torah, although we're blessed with a great Torah reader, I'm going to pay attention and see if it takes him an extra second to find it this week, although he probably prepared extra knowing this. So why? Why is it closed? And there's actually a Hebrew word for it, satum, which means closed, as opposed to ptucha, which is open. And there's other variations of it throughout the Torah, but the main one we're focusing on is a new section always has a line break. This doesn't. Why? And that's what we'll look at. So Gloria, as I said, I'm going to leave you open. And we just have a few sources today. And what's interesting is these sources are all fairly old. There's one pretty contemporary one from the 19th century. But for the most part, these few opinions have not been matched. There's no academic scholarly answer because this is not a mystical supernatural thing that's passed down with mythology surrounding it. We know that there were a group of rabbinic scholars who spent several hundred years intentionally correcting and perfecting the text that we have today. So why didn't they have an open break at the beginning of that? And again, these answers really capture everything. So the oldest one that we have is a midrashic source. And this is Midrash Tanchuma. This is from a more recent version of it. But this midrash, or this collection, was probably written between the 3rd and 7th centuries, probably somewhere in the Middle East, maybe Iraq, et cetera, like that. So it's quite an ancient source. So you already know that some of the breaks in the text predate the Masoretes, meaning that even though they fixed the text in the 7th to 10th century, they had Torah scrolls with breaks in them. And obviously, this break goes back even before the Masoretes and was intentionally put there by earlier scribes. So Gloria, go ahead, source number 2. Why is this one closed, please?
Why is this Parsha more closed than all other Parshiot? Because as soon as Jacob died, the servitude of Israel began. But another reason is that he desired to reveal the end of days, but it was closed off from him. And another reason is that he closed off all the troubles in the world from him.
Excellent, thank you. So all of these things in the Midrash will get expounded on more in the following rabbinic sources. But again, this is basically midrashic reasons, which, by the way, might be why there wasn't a break there. If the rabbis who wrote the text and fixed the text, and I don't mean they wrote it from scratch, I'm saying they had the text and the way they laid it out, if they decided to organize it based on midrashic ideas, then this may be the actual correct answer, or one of these might be. So they're suggesting that perhaps, there's something very dark coming. Usually at a new section of the Torah, we're excited for a new section. But here there's this darkness looming and we don't want it to be open. There's this, Rashi's going to expound on it more. There's this closing of our souls, and it's represented by the physical close in the text. Another midrashic idea is that when Yaakov speaks to his sons before the end of his life, he says, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen in the end of days. It sounds like he's going to give them a prophecy. But then when he opens his mouth, he tells each son, you're really smart, you're really strong. These don't sound like prophecies. It just sounds like he's telling them things about themselves that they may not be aware of. They lack self-awareness. And the rabbinic understanding of that is that what he's saying is, because you're really strong and you're quick to fight, you're going to get in fights, and it's going to, in the future, it's going to come back to bite you. Because you're really smart and brave, you're going to end up being a great leader. So he's not quite prophesying, but he's sort of hinting at it. But this midrashic understanding is that he literally opened his mouth to say, the Mashiach is going to come in 2021 on December 16th at 11:13 a.m. So we got a minute to go. But when he opened his mouth, prophecy was taken away from him and it was closed off. And the other idea will be unpacked in a later source, this idea that all the troubles of the world were closed to him. He had been struggling for years, and finally that chapter, as it were, was finally closed. So before we go on, there are any questions on this midrash or the technical things I talked about, this idea of open parshiot and closed ones and the Masoretes, etc. Any questions up until now? Yeah, Gloria, please.
Is this the only one that's closed like that?
Yeah, and in fact, I don't know if I brought the source, but some of the sources explicitly say this is the only one. I mean, this is the only parsha where it's completely closed at the beginning. There are within parshiot, there are openings and closings and stuff. Like if I'm reading in shul and I get to pick which aliyah I choose, I always choose one that has a break right before it. And even again, the best Torah readers, incredible Torah readers that I've been there for, the Nagabai checking their reading, whenever it's a closed section and the break is in the middle of a line, there's always a moment of hesitation, or almost always, which is totally fine. It's very difficult, but this is a very weird place to have it, a very weird place to have it. And it seems quite clear that it's intentional. It's certainly become intentional at some point in history. Excellent. So Isabel, Leonard and then Isabel. So Leonard, the source number 3 Rashi is actually going to quote the midrash we just read and bring in one more midrashic source. So we're kind of getting a whole, like the complete picture of the midrashic rabbinic ideas of why it's closed. So Leonard, go ahead, source number 3 Rashi.
And Yaakov lived. Why is Sidra totally closed? Because comprising, as it does, an account of the death of Yaakov, as soon as our father Yaakov departed his life, the hearts and eyes of Israel were closed. Their eyes became dim and their hearts troubled. Because of the misery of the bondage which they then began to impose upon them, another reason is that he, Yaakov, wished to reveal to his sons the date of the end of days, that is when Israel's exile would finally end. CF Rashi on Genesis 49, number 1. But the vision was closed, concealed from him. Genesis Rabbah 96.1.
Excellent, thank you. So it's funny, I put these in chronological order, but I realized I actually should have put Rashi first, because Rashi brings the two of the reasons, which is the idea that slavery is coming and there's this darkness. So his language here really that their eyes were closed, their hearts became dim and troubled. So Rashi really expounds on that idea. And the second idea he does is that Yaakov wanted to tell them what would happen in the future because he had this prophetic power, and it was closed off from him at the moment. So Rashi actually brings two reasons. The Midrash Tanhuma actually mentioned the third reason, which is that Yaakov had been for years struggling, going through all these tests and thinking that his beloved son was dead. And finally, again, that chapter was closed. So between Rashi and Midrash Tanhuma, we have three reasons here, which for the most part, the vast majority of rabbis basically deal with one of these three things, and we'll see another couple variations, but basically everyone's dealing with these three ideas, which is it's either about the coming slavery, which is going to happen very soon. This Parsha is moving into that. The second one is the idea that he had a prophecy that was closed off to him. And the third is not a negative one. It's closed because this is the closing of Jacob's life. And it's kind of cute that these beautiful ideas are represented symbolically in the way the text is set up. And in fact, that third idea about this being a closing of Yaakov's life, it just dovetails really well. And the reason I say that is because the next source, 13th century France, the Chizkuni, is actually going to find a problem with one of the explanations and say that's actually not a good explanation for what's going on here. So Isabel, going to go ahead and unmute you. And this is the rabbi known as Chizkuni, it's his last name. And he's going to mention Rashi, but then he's going to challenge Rashi's assumption for why it is a closed beginning. So please, Isabel.
Yaakov lived, according to Rashi. The reason why this portion has not been separated from the preceding portions by as much as the space of a single letter is because with the death of Yaakov, the eyes and hearts of his descendants were as if closed to the spiritual mission they were to bring to the world as they were being enslaved. We might well ask that, seeing that Joseph, his son, ruled in Egypt for another 54 years, during which all of his descendants enjoyed complete freedom, how is that possible? The answer is that this was not quite so. His family had become culturally too dependent on Egypt. Another interpretation for the omission of even a minimum amount of blank space in the Torah before the commencement of this portion is that the subject dealt with here was inextricably interwoven with what preceded it. That is, the Torah's description of the years during which Yaakov lived thus far.
Excellent. Thank you, Isabel. Did that fix the problem?
No, it didn't fix the problem for me.
Oh, I'm sorry. We'll figure it out another time, but thank you for reading.
Yeah.
So this brought in Rashi's idea, which was, why is it begin closed? It's intentional to let you know that something dark and looming and closed off, their hearts and minds are closed, is coming with the coming slavery. But Chizkuni says, and there are others who echo this idea as well, that doesn't make sense because they're about to have half a century of let the good times roll. So what do you mean something dark is coming? The beginning of our Parsha, even though it's the end of Yaakov's life, it's actually a beautiful moment. You know, he has closure with his sons. His children then again have a half a century of flourishing, because right now they're just a bunch of sons with their own kids. They're about to turn into a giant nation, which will be enslaved, but not for a long time. But then the Chizkuni answers it in a very interesting way. He says, yes, they are going to have prosperity, they're going to have freedom, but there is something that they're losing, something that is getting closed off here, and that is their connection with their spirituality, with their identity, with their Jewishness, their Israeliteness, and the land of Israel. And one of the things we talked about last week is when Yaakov was asked to go to the land of Egypt to see his son again, he was afraid, and God said, don't worry, it'll be okay. And the rabbi suggested one of his fears was just leaving the land of Israel and going to a lower spiritual place. And what happened is our people lost a lot of their identity. You know, they lost their path towards God. The rabbis say that they never lost their Jewish names, and they did keep a lot, but it's clear too that they also assimilated to a great extent, or at least according to Chizkuni. So yes, they weren't slaves, but they lost so much. Their connection to God in the land of Israel was slowly being shut off, and then they became slaves. And it's only when they cried out to God that God started to open that door again, as it were. So yes, things look good right now, but the path towards darkness has already started, according to the Chizkuni. Any questions up until now? Excellent. So what we've seen here is, again, there's clearly an intentional close in the text that was put there on purpose, likely to teach us something. There was something intentional about it. And again, perhaps there's some other reason that we're just not familiar with. We need a time machine. But regardless, it's likely that it was put there intentionally by rabbis in the 7th to 10th century with some, intentional meaning behind it. And one of these answers might be the right one. The last one that I want to look at here is the one that's relatively contemporary. This is from 19th century German, Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. Now, Rabbi Hirsch's commentary on the Torah, he was like the kind of one of the early modern Orthodox-ish rabbis, was written in German. Now, there is an English translation. I don't own it. So the best that I could find online was the German. I don't speak German. I speak a little bit of Yiddish, but it didn't really help too much here. So I looked up another source that said what he's generally talking about here, used Google Translate, and then I corrected some of the Google Translate. So if any of you reads German, you can correct my translation and say, no, you missed the point. But I think based on what I've read in other places, this is the gist. And it actually connects in some way to one of the ideas in the first source, the Midrash Tanchuma, or the second source. So Rabbi Shimshon Raphael supposedly says, wenn man bedenkt, if one considers that the 17 years that began were the only ones that Jacob lived through calmly. So our Parsha begins with the last 17 years of his life. So what was the nature of those 17 years? Only ones Jacob lived through calmly, and that they could therefore be regarded as the actual prime of his entire past life. These 17 years were awesome. He had Yosef again with his family. Everything was beautiful, right? One could have expected all the more that the story would be told through a special section that should be highlighted. So what they're saying here is this is the best time of Jacob's life. Everything was absolutely perfect. So what we should have had is another Parsha altogether. Sorry, something just popped up. I just have to turn off real quick. That there should have been another Parsha. Vayechi should have started with this whole section about, and Yaakov played with his grandchildren. Obviously, we have some of that, but there should have been a whole other story, almost 20 years. What was Yaakov doing during this time? It was an awesome time. But Rav Hirsch continues, its absence, however, teaches us that these 17 years count individually, meaning they were important to Yaakov. But the Torah is not a story about Yaakov. He's a main character, but it's not his book. Rather, he continues, but nationally, they were less significant. In other words, Yaakov's story was important to him, but to the story of our people, those 20 years didn't matter. To understand where we came from, who we are, our journey, we don't need to do what we don't need to know what Yaakov did for the last 20 years of his life in retirement. It's beautiful that he was happy, but that's not important to the thrust. So Rav Hirsch continues, rather, after the years of a troubled, depressed life in which the test had to be passed to acquire the name Israel. So it's after decades and decades of really going through tough things and Lavan and everything like that. And the following 17 years are only the pleasant, rewarding conclusion. Rav Hirsch's point here is that there's kind of a missing section in the Torah. And if you've ever edited a piece of text where there's a clear, break in a new section, and then you edit it out, you just cut it out, it'll collapse two sections. In other words, there is a new section that does have a break in it, but it was taken out because it's not important to the story. And so what we actually see is that last week's Parasha, Vayigash, should have had a section in between it with an opening, but instead that wasn't included, and it goes directly into our Parsha this week because it's a direct continuation of the story. So even though we're reading it as two separate portions and two separate weeks, it's really one long story. And if you say, then why does it, it's a new week, it should have had a break. There was a section that had a break in it, but it wasn't included because it wasn't important to the story. There are 20 years of one of the most important people of the Torah cut out. And if you cut that out, you can see what I did here with these ellipses. There's sections I cut out of it, and it looks like it's just one block of text, but obviously there's more to it. There's more things that were left out there. So Rav Hirsch's point is, there was a Parsha that was left out that should have had an opening in a new section, but it was cut out because it wasn't important to the greater story. And because it was cut out, two sections were compacted, and it just becomes a continuation. Forget about this middle section. Even though it would have had a break in it, we're going to ignore it and just keep rolling with the story. And because we're just continuing, there's no greater significance to it being closed other than it's just the story keep going. Forget about Yaakov. Just keep moving. Don't start a new section. Just keep going. Now, that may or may not be the final right answer, but it also it fits in a lot of ways, is the story really does just keep rolling. Now, the challenge to that is there's plenty of Parshas where it leaves off on a cliffhanger and just continues right away. So why don't we have those go together? So what we're left with is the idea, or not the idea we've left with, is that we don't know the final answer for why this is closed, but we do know it was intentional. And it reminds me of a famous story in the Talmud that Moshe went to God and said, God, I want to see what's going to happen with my Torah and everything that I've been working on. So God puts him in a DeLorean, sends him to the future with Michael J. Fox, and he goes to the yeshiva, I believe, of Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva has the Torah text there, and he's talking about, if you've seen the Torah letters, let's see if they have it in the text I brought. Do they? It doesn't have it on this text here, but in an actual Torah scroll, the letters, they don't have these dots, but they do have little crowns, like little things that stick up, and they make it look really fancy. And Rabbi Akiva says, these little crowns, which again, you don't have in front of you, these little crowns teach you X, Y, and Z. And Moshe says, I didn't say that. I never said that those what they were there for. And God says, look, that's kind of the point of it. you put things in place so that future generations can get new lessons out of them. That's kind of the whole point of Midrash. Even though you may have written them down for reason X, the point is the Torah is alive, and there's 70 different ways to interpret it. And every one of those ways has value for a different generation, for a different person, for a different community. And that's exactly what we saw today. This simple little thing that most people wouldn't think of unless you're trying to find your place in the text. Why is it closed? Why is it unique? It's clearly telling us something. It's asking to be explained. It's asking to be built upon, but it leaves a lot of vagueness about what exactly is it trying to tell us. And that's the beauty of the text. We are left all of these artifacts from the past that are begging for us to come up with new ideas, but perhaps it's intentional that there's this vagueness so that every generation we can come up with a new idea. And as you saw, all of these ideas, some can be kind of rejected, but we don't really know what's right. And you don't have an academic scholar who says, no, I figured out the reason and I reject everything and here's the reason. No, this is something that was left by a previous generation, and it's still sparking new ideas and new conversations. It's left things unresolved. The Torah itself, this section may be closed, but the Torah itself is still wide open to interpretation, and it probably always will be.